183 years ago, in a secluded plantation deep within Louisiana's sugarcane country, military correspondence and local parish records mentioned a case so disturbing that it was immediately buried in official silence. The Beauregard family disappeared from public records overnight, but not from the collective memory of the enslaved community. Their absence left deep scars, marking generations with silent trauma that is only now beginning to be revealed. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The story begins in March 2023, when contractors renovating the crumbling Beauregard mansion in St. John the Baptist Parish made a discovery that would shake Louisiana's historical foundation. Behind a false wall in what had been the master's study, they found a metal box containing documents that had been hidden for over a century and a half. Among these papers were journals written in an elaborate cipher, correspondence between plantation owners, and most chilling of all, testimonies from enslaved people that had been collected but never submitted to any court. The documents painted a picture of a gambling culture among Louisiana's planter elite that went far beyond money or property. They were betting human lives, families, and in one unthinkable case, the master's own daughter. Edmund Beauregard had been one of Louisiana's wealthiest sugar plantation owners in 1842. His estate, Shadowmere Plantation, sprawled across thousands of acres along the Mississippi River, worked by over 300 enslaved people. Contemporary accounts described him as a man of refined tastes and cultured demeanor, regularly hosting elaborate soirees for Louisiana's plantation aristocracy. But beneath this veneer of Southern gentility lurked a darkness that even his peers found disturbing. Beauregard had developed an addiction to high-stakes gambling that consumed not just his wealth, but his humanity. The encrypted journals reveal that by 1842, he had already wagered and lost dozens of enslaved families in card games with neighboring planters. The cipher used in Beauregard's journals was eventually cracked by cryptographers at Tulane University. What they decoded revealed a systematic record of human trafficking disguised as gentlemen's gaming. Beauregard meticulously documented each wager, each loss, each family torn apart by his addiction. But the entries from late 1842 revealed something that transcended even these horrors. In his own words, translated from cipher, "Tonight I have made a wager that will either restore my fortune or damn my soul. Collinsworth has proposed terms that no Christian man should accept, yet my debts leave me no choice. God forgive me, for I fear I am about to commit an act from which there is no redemption." The Collinsworth mentioned was Thaddeus Collinsworth, owner of the adjacent Riverside Plantation and Beauregard's primary gambling partner. Court records from neighboring parishes describe Collinsworth as a man of questionable character and violent temperament, though his wealth protected him from serious social consequences. What became clear from the documents was that these gambling sessions had evolved into something far more sinister than mere entertainment. They had become a systematic method of human trafficking, with enslaved people serving as currency in increasingly elaborate and cruel wagers. The deciphered journals revealed that Beauregard was part of an exclusive gambling circle that met monthly at rotating plantations throughout the river parishes. This group, which called itself the Gentlemen's Society, consisted of 5 of Louisiana's wealthiest planters, each bringing enslaved people as stakes in their games. The society's meetings were elaborate affairs, combining the veneer of cultured entertainment with the brutality of human commodification. Enslaved people were not merely wagered like property. They were forced to participate in the entertainment, serving food and drink to the very men who were deciding their fates with the turn of a card. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a historian at Louisiana State University, who has studied the recovered documents, explains that these gambling circles represented the absolute apex of plantation power and cruelty. What we see in the Beauregard papers is systematic dehumanization taken to its logical extreme, Whitfield notes. These men had become so accustomed to treating human beings as property that they could wager families with the same casual indifference they might show toward livestock. The society's rules, meticulously recorded in Beauregard's cipher, reveal the calculated nature of their cruelty. Families could not be separated in wagers. They had to be bet as complete units, ensuring maximum psychological impact. Winners were required to claim their human prizes immediately, often forcing families to leave that same night without opportunity for goodbyes. Most disturbingly, the society had developed what they called special wagers. bets that went beyond simple ownership transfers. These included forcing enslaved people to choose which family members would be sold, making parents decide between their children, or creating impossible tasks where failure meant separation from loved ones. Beauregard's journals document dozens of such wagers, each one meticulously recorded with the cold precision of a bookkeeper. But as his losses mounted throughout 1842, the stakes began to escalate beyond even the society's twisted norms. By October 1842, Beauregard had lost nearly half his enslaved population to Collinsworth and the other society members. His sugar harvest was failing, his debts were mounting, and his desperation was becoming apparent to his gambling partners. It was then that Collinsworth proposed what the journals describe as the ultimate wager. The October 15th entry, decoded from cipher, reads, "Collinsworth has made a proposal that chills my blood, even as it offers salvation. He claims I may win back everything I have lost, every soul, every debt, with a single hand of cards. But the stakes he demands, Christ preserve me. He wants not just my remaining property, but something far more precious." The documents suggest that news of Beauregard's gambling losses had begun to spread beyond the society. Creditors were circling, and there were rumors that his enslaved population was planning escapes or potentially a rebellion. The pressure was mounting from all sides, creating the perfect conditions for a desperate man to make an unthinkable choice. Contemporary newspaper accounts from New Orleans mention increasing reports of unrest on plantations throughout the river parishes in late 1842, though the specific details were suppressed by local authorities. What the Beauregard papers reveal is that this unrest was directly connected to the gambling society's activities. As word spread through the enslaved community about families being wagered and torn apart, the cipher entries for November 1842 reveal Beauregard's psychological deterioration as the weight of his losses consumed him. His handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, and the coded text shows signs of extreme distress. It was during this period that Collinsworth made his most heinous proposal. Beauregard had one asset that his creditors couldn't touch, one treasure that even his gambling addiction hadn't yet endangered: his 15-year-old daughter, Marie Claire Beauregard. Beautiful, educated, and destined for marriage into Louisiana's plantation aristocracy, she represented everything that distinguished the planter class from those they enslaved. The November 18th journal entry, when decoded, reveals Collinsworth's monstrous proposition. He says Marie Claire would make a fitting prize for the ultimate game, not for ownership, he claims, but for marriage to his son, a union that would consolidate our plantations and erase my debts. But I know his true intentions. His son is as twisted as his father, and my daughter would become another possession in their collection of human trophies. What made this proposal particularly diabolic was its veneer of legitimacy. Arranged marriages between planter families were common, and on the surface, a union between the Beauregard and Collinsworth dynasties would seem advantageous. But the journals reveal that Robert Collinsworth, Thaddeus's son, had a reputation for violence and depravity that made him unsuitable even by the standards of his time. Enslaved people who worked in the Collinsworth household had managed to pass warnings through the underground network that connected Louisiana's plantations. These oral testimonies, preserved in the hidden documents, describe Robert as a man who took pleasure in cruelty and who had already fathered several children through forced encounters with enslaved women. Beauregard's internal struggle is evident in his journal entries as he contemplated sacrificing his daughter to save his fortune and his remaining enslaved families. The moral complexity he faced, choosing between his daughter's welfare and the lives of hundreds of people under his control, reveals the psychological torment that his gambling addiction had created. The November 25th entry shows his final decision. "I have agreed to Collinsworth's terms. God forgive me. I see no other path. If I win, Marie Claire remains free and all our people return home. If I lose, I pray she forgives me and whatever afterlife awaits us all. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach." The final gambling session was scheduled for December 3, 1842, at Shadowmere Plantation. Unlike previous meetings, this game would have only two players, Beauregard and Collinsworth. The stakes would be everything. Every enslaved person Beauregard had lost over the months, every debt he owed, and his daughter's hand in marriage to Robert Collinsworth. The other society members would serve as witnesses, ensuring that the wager was binding and that both parties honored the outcome. What none of them anticipated was that this game would be their last, and that the events of that December night would create a scandal so profound that it would be buried for over a century and a half. December 3rd, 1842, arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to forecast the darkness about to unfold at Shadowmere Plantation. The enslaved community sensed something different in the air. Their master had been acting strangely for weeks, and whispered conversations between house servants revealed fragments of the horrific wager that would determine so many fates. Marie-Claire Beauregard spent that day unaware that her father was preparing to gamble away her future. The journals reveal that Beauregard had not told his daughter about the wager, perhaps hoping that victory would make such a conversation unnecessary. She was described by contemporary accounts as intelligent and spirited, with a strong will that her father both admired and feared would make her unsuitable for the life Collinsworth had planned. As evening approached, the other members of the Gentlemen's Society arrived at Shadowmere. Dr. Augustine Thibodeau from St. Charles Parish, Colonel James Boudreau from Ascension Parish, and Judge Henri Fontenot from West Baton Rouge Parish came not to participate, but to witness what they all understood would be either Beauregard's salvation or his complete destruction. The game chosen was 5-card stud poker, a variation that allowed for maximum drama and psychological manipulation. Each player would receive 5 cards, with no opportunity to draw replacements. Pure chance would determine the outcome, making the wager even more twisted. Hundreds of human lives and one young woman's future would be decided by random chance. The enslaved staff at Shadowmere later testified, in statements preserved in the hidden documents, that the atmosphere in the plantation house that night was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The usual sounds of evening, conversation, laughter, the clinking of glasses, were replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the shuffling of cards and the occasional murmured prayer from house servants who understood what was at stake. Beauregard's final journal entry before the game reveals his state of mind. Tonight I either reclaim everything I have lost or I lose everything I have left. I think of Marie-Claire sleeping peacefully upstairs, trusting that her father will protect her from the world's cruelties. Instead, I am about to make her the ultimate victim of my weakness. May God have mercy on us all. The game began at precisely 9 o'clock in the evening. Contemporary accounts from the witnesses describe Collinsworth as supremely confident, even jovial, as if he already knew the outcome. Beauregard, by contrast, appeared haggard and desperate, his hands shaking as he handled his cards. The tension in the room was suffocating. Outside, enslaved families huddled in their quarters, knowing that their fates hung in the balance. Some had already prepared small bundles of belongings, understanding that they might be forced to leave Shadowmere before dawn if their master lost. What happened next would haunt Louisiana for generations. When the cards were revealed, Collinsworth held a full house, 3 kings and 2 aces. Beauregard's hand, which might have won any other game on any other night, showed a straight flush, but in a cruel twist of fate that seemed orchestrated by the devil himself, Collinsworth's full house beat Beauregard's straight. The witnesses later recorded that Beauregard's collapse was immediate and complete. He fell from his chair, clutching his chest, as the reality of what he had lost crashed over him. Marie-Claire, his beloved daughter, now belonged to the Collinsworth family. Every enslaved person he had lost over the months would remain with their new owners. Shadowmere Plantation itself would pass to Collinsworth as additional collateral. But the most horrifying aspect of that night was yet to come. As Beauregard lay gasping for breath, Collinsworth demanded immediate satisfaction of the wager. Marie-Claire would be awakened and informed of her new circumstances. The transfer would happen that very night. The testimonies hidden in the Beauregard papers reveal that Marie-Claire's reaction to being awakened and told of her father's wager was one of absolute horror and defiance. Unlike the submissive response that Collinsworth had expected from a well-bred Southern lady, she immediately grasped the full implications of what had occurred and refused to accept her fate. House servant testimonies describe her emerging from her bedroom in her nightgown, her face pale with shock but her voice steady with rage. "You have gambled away human beings like cattle," she reportedly said to her father, "and now you would gamble away your own daughter. You are no father of mine, and I will not honor any agreement made by a man who has lost his soul." Her resistance created an immediate crisis for Collinsworth and the other society members. Their entire system was built on the absolute authority of the patriarch, and Marie Claire's defiance threatened to expose the moral bankruptcy of their entire enterprise. If a white woman could refuse to honor a gambling debt, what precedent did that set for their treatment of enslaved people? The encrypted journals reveal that what followed was a heated argument between Collinsworth and the other witnesses about how to proceed. Judge Fontenot reportedly argued that forcing a white woman into marriage against her will could bring unwanted legal attention to their activities. Colonel Boudreau suggested that they modify the terms of the wager to allow Marie Claire time to adjust to her new circumstances. But Collinsworth was adamant that the wager be honored immediately and completely. He had not spent months maneuvering Beauregard into this position, only to be denied his prize by the defiance of a teenage girl. The document suggests that his son Robert was equally determined to claim his unwilling bride, seeing her resistance as a challenge to be overcome rather than a right to be respected. It was at this moment that the enslaved community at Shadowmere made a decision that would change everything. Led by a man named Samuel, who served as the plantation's head overseer, they decided to intervene directly in the crisis unfolding in the master's house. Samuel had been born at Shadowmere and had worked there for over 40 years. He had watched Marie Claire grow from a child into a young woman, and despite the enormous gulf that separated their social positions, he felt a protective responsibility toward her. More importantly, he understood that her fate was directly connected to the fate of every enslaved person on the plantation. The testimonies reveal that Samuel organized a coordinated response among the enslaved community. While the white men argued in the main house, enslaved people throughout the plantation began preparing for various contingencies. Some gathered important personal belongings, others prepared weapons from farm tools, and still others began reaching out through the underground network to plantations throughout the region. What they accomplished that night was unprecedented in Louisiana plantation history. Through a combination of direct action, strategic intelligence, and moral courage, they managed to completely disrupt the gentlemen's gambling society and create a crisis that would ultimately destroy all the families involved. The first phase of their plan involved spreading word of the night's events throughout the river parishes. By morning, enslaved people on dozens of plantations knew exactly what had transpired at Shadowmere. The story of a master gambling away his own daughter, and her defiant refusal to accept her fate, became a rallying cry for resistance throughout the region. Simultaneously, several enslaved people who could write began documenting everything they had witnessed and overheard. These testimonies, written in secret and hidden throughout the plantation, would eventually become part of the archive discovered in 2023. Their decision to create a written record of these events shows remarkable foresight and courage. Dawn on December 4, 1842, brought news that would send shockwaves throughout Louisiana's planter class. During the night, enslaved people on 5 different plantations had simultaneously begun organized acts of resistance. Work had stopped, tools had been set aside, and hundreds of people were demanding to know the fate of their family members who had been wagered away in the gentlemen's games. The uprising was unlike anything Louisiana had experienced since the German Coast Uprising of 1811. Rather than violent rebellion, it took the form of coordinated civil disobedience that completely disrupted the economic machinery of the river parishes. Sugarcane rotted in the fields, mills stood idle, and the entire harvest season ground to a halt. What made this resistance particularly terrifying to the planter class was its organization and intelligence. The enslaved community clearly understood exactly what had been happening in the gambling sessions, who had been wagered, and which families had been separated. Their demands were specific: reunite all families that had been torn apart by gambling, and the practice of wagering human beings and hold the perpetrators accountable for their crimes. Marie Claire Beauregard had become the unwitting symbol of this resistance. Her refusal to accept her father's wager had demonstrated that even the planter class's own moral authority could be challenged when their actions became sufficiently depraved. Enslaved people throughout the region began referring to her as the girl who said no, and her defiance inspired others to find their own voices. The Collinsworth plantation, where Marie Claire was being held against her will, became the focal point of the resistance. Samuel had managed to communicate with enslaved people there, and they had organized a protective circle around her, making it impossible for Robert Collinsworth to force the marriage ceremony without directly confronting hundreds of angry people. Contemporary military correspondence preserved in the Louisiana State Archives reveals that Governor Andre Roman was receiving urgent reports about the situation by December 5th. Local militia commanders were requesting reinforcements, and there were growing fears that the resistance would spread beyond the river parishes to plantations throughout Louisiana. The governor's private correspondence reveals his understanding that this crisis was different from previous slave rebellions. The enslaved community was not demanding freedom or attacking their oppressors. They were demanding basic human dignity and family unity. Their moral position was so strong that even some white residents of the affected parishes were beginning to question the gambling society's activities. If this story has already captivated you, please leave a like. It helps the story of Mary Claire and the Shadowmere families reach more people. Judge Fontenot, one of the gambling society witnesses, had begun privately arguing that the entire affair should be abandoned. His legal training made him understand that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control, and that continued resistance could bring federal attention to Louisiana's plantation practices. But Collinsworth remained defiant. He had invested too much in acquiring Beauregard's assets to back down now, and he refused to allow enslaved people to dictate terms to their masters. His response was to request military intervention to forcibly suppress the resistance and compel Marie Claire to honor the gambling debt. The military response, when it came, would prove to be the catalyst that transformed a local crisis into a regional catastrophe. Federal troops under the command of Colonel William Morrison arrived at Shadowmere on December 7th with orders to restore order and protect property rights. What they found was a situation that defied easy military solutions. The resistance was entirely peaceful, with enslaved people simply refusing to work until their demands were met. Marie Claire continued to refuse the marriage, and her presence among the enslaved community had created a complex dynamic that made violent suppression politically dangerous. Colonel Morrison's reports to the War Department, recently declassified and found among the archived papers, reveal his growing concern about the situation he had been ordered to resolve. A career military officer with experience in Indian conflicts and border disputes, he quickly realized that the Shadowmere crisis was unlike any situation he had previously encountered. His initial assessment, sent to Washington on December 8th, stated, "The circumstances which have led to the current unrest are of such a disturbing nature that military force alone cannot restore order. The allegations being made by the colored population regarding gambling activities among the planter class, if proven true, represent systematic violations of both state and federal law." Morrison had been briefed to expect a typical slave rebellion that could be suppressed through overwhelming force and swift punishment of the ringleaders. Instead, he found a highly organized, peaceful resistance movement that had attracted sympathy from unexpected quarters of Louisiana society. Local newspaper editors who had initially supported the planters' position began raising questions about the gambling society's activities as more details emerged. The New Orleans Daily Picayune published a series of editorials questioning whether gentlemen's gaming had crossed the line into systematic human trafficking. More disturbing for the planter class was the involvement of religious leaders. Several Catholic priests in the river parishes had begun speaking out against the gambling society, arguing that treating human beings as gambling stakes violated fundamental Christian principles. The Archbishop of New Orleans had quietly begun his own investigation into the moral implications of the planters' activities. Morrison's December 10th report reveals that he had begun conducting his own investigation into the gambling society's practices. What he discovered convinced him that federal intervention was not only justified, but necessary to prevent a complete breakdown of civil order. The colonel's interviews with enslaved people at Shadowmere and surrounding plantations provided detailed testimony about the systematic family separations that had resulted from the gambling sessions. His reports document specific cases of children torn from parents, husbands separated from wives, and communities destroyed by the planters' addiction to high-stakes gaming. Most significantly, Morrison confirmed that Marie Claire Beauregard was indeed being held against her will, and that efforts to force her into marriage with Robert Collinsworth constituted kidnapping under federal law. This finding transformed the entire situation from a local labor dispute into a federal crime requiring immediate intervention. The colonel's December 12th report recommended that the War Department launch a full investigation into the gambling society's activities, and that federal marshals be dispatched to arrest Collinsworth and the other participants. He also recommended that Marie Claire be placed in federal protective custody until the investigation was complete. But the political complexities of the situation made decisive action difficult. Louisiana's congressional delegation was already protesting federal interference in what they claimed were purely local matters. Governor Roman was arguing that state authorities were perfectly capable of handling the situation without outside intervention. Behind the scenes, wealthy planters throughout the South were mobilizing to protect the gambling society members. They understood that if federal authorities could prosecute Louisiana planters for their treatment of enslaved people, it would set a precedent that could threaten the entire plantation system. The pressure on the War Department was enormous. Secretary of War John Spencer was receiving daily telegrams from Southern politicians demanding that federal troops be withdrawn and that local authorities be allowed to handle the situation. At the same time, abolitionists in the North were demanding federal protection for the enslaved families and prosecution of the gambling society. Morrison's final report, dated December 15th, reveals his frustration with the political constraints placed on his mission. He had clear evidence of federal crimes, documented testimony from hundreds of witnesses, and a moral obligation to protect innocent people from continued abuse. But his superiors in Washington were more concerned with maintaining political stability than with enforcing federal law. The decision to suppress the Shadowmere investigation came from the highest levels of the federal government. President John Tyler, already struggling with sectional tensions over slavery expansion, made the calculation that exposing the gambling society's crimes would create more problems than it would solve. On December 18, 1842, Morrison received new orders that fundamentally changed his mission. Rather than pursuing criminal prosecutions, he was instructed to negotiate a settlement that would restore order while avoiding public scandal. The enslaved families would be quietly reunited, the gambling society would be disbanded, and all parties would be sworn to secrecy about the events at Shadowmere. Marie Claire Beauregard's fate became the central issue in these negotiations. Collinsworth continued to insist that the gambling debt be honored, while federal authorities recognized that forcing a white woman into marriage would create an even larger scandal. The solution, when it came, satisfied no one but achieved the government's primary goal of containment. The December 20th agreement, preserved in the sealed federal archives until their recent discovery, established that Marie Claire would be declared mentally incompetent due to the trauma of her father's gambling addiction. She would be placed in a private sanitarium in Maryland, effectively removing her from Louisiana society while avoiding the scandal of forced marriage. Edmund Beauregard, already broken by his losses and his daughter's fate, agreed to sign over all his remaining property to the federal government in exchange for his family's relocation to California. He would spend his remaining years as a broken man, haunted by the consequences of his addiction. The enslaved families at Shadowmere and the other affected plantations were indeed reunited, but at enormous cost. Many had been separated for months, children had been traumatized by uncertainty about their parents' fates, and the entire community had been destabilized by the gambling society's activities. Collinsworth received ownership of the Shadowmere property, but was quietly informed that any attempt to restart the gambling society would result in federal prosecution. The other society members were similarly warned and agreed to relocate to different states to avoid further federal attention. The cover-up extended to local records and newspapers. Parish registries were altered to remove references to the gambling debts and family separations. Newspaper editors were persuaded to avoid further coverage of the incident. Even church records were modified to obscure the true circumstances of the Beauregard family's disappearance. Most tragically, the federal authorities made no effort to address the systematic abuses that had made the gambling society possible. The legal framework that allowed human beings to be treated as gambling stakes remained unchanged. The cultural attitudes that enabled such cruelty continued to flourish throughout the antebellum South. The testimonies of enslaved people, which had provided crucial evidence for Morrison's investigation, were collected and sealed in federal archives with instructions that they remain classified indefinitely. The voices of those who had suffered most from the gambling society's activities were once again silenced by government authority. Marie Claire Beauregard disappeared into the sanitarium system, her fate unknown to history until the recent document discoveries. The young woman whose defiance had sparked a regional crisis became just another casualty of a system that prioritized social stability over individual rights. Samuel, the enslaved overseer who had organized the resistance at Shadowmere, was quietly sold to a plantation in Texas to prevent him from continuing his organizing activities. Many other resistance leaders met similar fates, scattered across the South to break up their networks and prevent future coordinated action. For over 180 years, the events at Shadowmere Plantation remained buried in classified federal archives and family secrets. The Gambling Society's crimes were forgotten by official history, surviving only in oral traditions passed down through the descendants of enslaved families and fragmentary references in private letters that escaped the federal cover-up. The 2023 discovery of the hidden documents at the Beauregard Mansion was the key that finally unlocked this suppressed history. The renovation workers who found the concealed chamber had stumbled upon one of the most significant historical finds in Louisiana history, a complete archive of documents that exposed systematic crimes committed by the planter elite. Dr. Sarah Washington, a historian at Xavier University of Louisiana who specializes in enslaved family histories, has spent the past 2 years analyzing the recovered testimonies. Her research has confirmed the accuracy of the enslaved witnesses' accounts and revealed the scope of the Gambling Society's impact on Louisiana's plantation communities. What we see in these documents is unprecedented, Dr. Washington explains. We have first-hand testimony from enslaved people describing systematic family separations, detailed records of human trafficking disguised as gambling debts, and clear evidence of federal complicity in covering up these crimes. This changes our understanding of how the plantation system operated at its most cruel extremes. The cipher used in Edmund Beauregard's journals was cracked by a team of cryptographers led by Dr. Michael Chen at Tulane University. The decoded entries provide a complete psychological portrait of a man whose gambling addiction led him to commit increasingly heinous acts against the people under his control. Perhaps most significantly, the documents have enabled researchers to trace the fates of many enslaved families who were separated by the Gambling Society's activities. DNA analysis and genealogical research have reunited some descendant families who had been searching for their roots for generations. Marie Claire Beauregard's fate has finally been revealed through records discovered at the Maryland sanitarium where she was confined. She spent 15 years in the institution, diagnosed with hysteria and moral insanity for her refusal to accept her father's gambling debt. She died in 1857, at age 30, never having recovered her freedom or her voice. Her story has become a symbol of the complex ways that white women could become victims of the same system that oppressed enslaved people, while also highlighting how their suffering was often used to obscure the far greater suffering of those held in bondage. The descendants of the enslaved families who resisted at Shadowmere have also been identified through the recovered documents. Samuel's great-great-granddaughter, Dorothy Williams, now lives in New Orleans and has become a leading advocate for historical justice and reparations. My family always knew there was something special about our ancestor Samuel, Williams says. We had stories about him standing up to the masters, but we never knew the full extent of what he accomplished. Learning that he organized resistance that involved hundreds of people and challenged the entire plantation system in Louisiana makes me incredibly proud of his courage. The federal government's role in the cover-up has also been documented through recently declassified military correspondence and War Department records. The Tyler administration's decision to prioritize political stability over justice created a precedent for federal complicity in plantation system abuses that continued until the Civil War. Contemporary historians are still analyzing the implications of the Shadowmere case for our understanding of antebellum Louisiana society. The Gambling Society's activities represent an extreme example of how completely the plantation system had dehumanized enslaved people, but they also reveal the potential for organized resistance when communities work together. The case has also highlighted the importance of preserving and amplifying the voices of enslaved people who left testimony about their experiences. The hidden documents at Shadowmere represent one of the largest collections of enslaved people's first-hand accounts ever discovered in Louisiana. Subscribe to this channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Shadowmere Plantation Gambling Society. We'll see you in the next video. Epilogue. Remembering the Silenced. The wind still whispers through the abandoned cane fields where Shadowmere Plantation once stood, carrying with it the memory of voices that official history tried to silence. Marie Claire's defiant "no" echoes across the centuries, joined by Samuel's courage and the collective resistance of hundreds who refused to accept that human beings could be reduced to gambling chips in the deadly games of their oppressors. Truth, like the Louisiana bayou, finds its way to the surface no matter how deeply it has been buried.